Hey everybody, Aaron Cowan, Sage Dynamics, and this is the Atlas Gunworks Athena. When you get towards the top of double stack 9mm in the 1911 style, sometimes called 2011s, sometimes referred to as 2019s depending on the manufacturer, it's rare air. Not every company that makes a 1911 makes a double stack in a 2011 style. Atlas is of course one of the small handful of companies that does produce one of those double stack guns. And we've seen a resurgence recently, probably over the past couple years, in the popularity of this style of gun. Even though the design harkens back to over 100 years ago now, there are some redeeming qualities and some performance qualities that we get from this particular type of gun. So the question always is, because they tend to be a little bit more expensive than a polymer striker fired gun, or even some of the older but still relevant double action, single actions that you get from some companies, is there a lot of value in paying that much for a handgun? Ultimately, that's what it usually comes down to as well, is cost. If I can get high quality for $600, why would I spend $1,000 or $5,000 or $6,000 for a gun that shoots the same round as a $600 gun? Are there going to be appreciable improvements, values, ergonomics, controls, and features that are going to make all that extra money worth it? And some people, they kind of get nervous about spending that much on a handgun. I don't really think about it that way, because some people wouldn't spend $2,000 on a handgun, but they wouldn't bat an eye to spend $2,000 on a rifle. I'm just buying a firearm, and I'm looking for that firearm to perform the best it possibly can in the category that it's in, be it handgun, rifle, shotgun, etc. So I have been working my way through the available double stack 9mm in the 1911 style, be it 2011, 2019, whatever you want to call it. And eventually I knew I was going to arrive at Atlas Gunworks. And while on the outside of it, it is a significant investment to get one of these guns, I wanted to do it anyway to see if, well, there was some performance there, if there were some noticeable features there, if there was some advantages there over similar tier, if you will, guns in this particular style. The very first thing I noticed when I picked up my Atlas Athena was the fact that the grip, the frame, if you will, was a little bit of a departure from some of the other double stack 9mm styles. First thing noticing is there is no grip safety. It's been removed, which I do appreciate. One of the big concerns that some people have when removing or pinning that device, because a lot of people, they'll just use a rubber grommet and pin it. That's something you see competition shooters do, and people who've carried these guns for serious purposes have done the same thing to forego that step in activation of the gun, because it does have a manual safety. But one of the big concerns, of course, is safety. Is the gun now not drop safe? Well, I'm going to drop this thing in this video, and anytime and some people may not be aware of this, anytime I do a drop test, there actually is a charged cartridge in the barrel, loaded in the chamber. I take just a 9mm casing that has a primer in it, remove the bullet, of course, throw it in there, so if the gun isn't drop safe, I get that pop that lets me know, hey, this thing, the firing pin just went, hammer went, firing pin went, striker went, what have you. And had there been a real bullet in it, it would have made a much louder noise and caused some property or some personal damage. So that's one thing that some people are concerned about. I can tell you that after dropping all the 2011s I've done over the past couple months, that's not been a problem, and if it had been, I would have told you about it. But it's something that I was definitely going to see with the Atlas, because they are foregoing that grip safety that some people attribute the gun being drop safe to that feature alone. Another thing you're immediately going to notice with the Atlas Athena is the grip, and I already started to talk about that. The fact that it has these replaceable panels. A lot of aftermarket, well, I won't say aftermarket, a lot of companies that produce a 2011 style gun, a double stack 9mm, whatever you want to call it, they pretty much just use staccato frames. You see a lot of staccato frames with someone else's roll mark or brand name or engraving on the slide work, and even maybe somewhere on the frame. Atlas is taking an approach of, we wanted to create something that's going to add a little bit more benefit for what you're willing to pay for the gun, and it has removable grip panels. Mine shipped with standard grip inserts on the aluminum frame, and then I had options for weighted, swelled, and my favorite, kind of just almost like a fillet. It being a left-handed shooter, put that there, my fingers almost perfectly mate to that area on the gun, and then it just fills in nicely. So it gives me more purchase on the gun, even when using a highly aggressive forward thumb style grip that I usually use for closer distances or shooting faster. So I was automatically appreciative of that. The one bad thing about that panel, if there is anything, is I have to remove the flared mag well to change it out. That creates some issues, and then had to put a blind pin back in there to get it back together. So reassembly of the system was slightly aggravating, and some directions in the bag would have been nice, but I worked through it. Caused a little bit of marring, but ultimately a gun I'm going to be dropping on concrete. I'm not worried about a little bit of cosmetic marring on the mag well that's going to be, well, shredded a little bit anyway. What else are you getting from the Athena? Well, besides their Atlas Alpha grip, you're getting a 4.6-inch bull barrel that is optics ready using their proprietary optics system. It defaults to an RMR style footprint. Of course, being single action only, just based on the operating system of the 2011. And I've got a very, well, specific trigger. They quoted it being around in the 2 pounds of pull neighborhood, and they ain't lying. As far as kind of the esoteric fit and finish, if you will, you can, and just based on my experience, you can tell a good 1911 or a good 2011 just by the way that the gun feels. Picking it up, cycling it, working the controls, the ambidextrous safety, and of course the magazine release, you can tell just how much work and attention went into properly mating the parts together to get them to work as well as possible. One of the things and one of the potential downsides that we have to this style of gun is if it's not assembled correctly, you are going to have reliability issues. Either you have to make the tolerances so loose that it's basically a merengue, or you have to make them so tight that the user has to be aware of maintenance schedules in order to keep the gun running. My personal problem that I've had with this style of gun, being a primarily left-handed handgun shooter, has been ambi safeties. Generally, the safety needed for left thumb deactivation is an afterthought. So that's placing a safety on the right side of the gun is generally an afterthought, and they don't always provide the same degree of manipulation and ease of manipulation that you get from a right-handed style gun. So very first thing with the Athena I notice is it doesn't matter which hand you're holding it with, that safety is going to sweep efficiently. There is force to overcome, which we want. It's not too loose, it's not too tight, it's in that Goldilocks category of operation. And then we get into the actual gun itself. The optics system seemed, it just initially getting into the roost, seemed very well thought out. They did go very, very deep in the slide, which is something you can do with this style of gun, but the plate was thick enough to give me more than 1 or 2 or 3 threads of contact when mounting an optic to it. Includes recoil bosses, which some people say, you know, with the durability that we get from optics today, you don't really need those anymore. And I'm like, yeah, but why get rid of them if they can add additional benefit over a durable optic or in addition to a durable optic? So I'm glad they left those on there. The sighting system is rear priority. However, it's, some people use the term co-witness. Co-witness just means I can see the sights through the glass. Some people use the term lower 1/3, which is more of a rifle term. But on this handgun, it's almost like lower quarter. On the Athena, these sights stick up just enough to clear the body. In this case, I used a 508, which does have a little bit of a height over an RMR. They're right around in the same neighborhood, but generally the RMR sits like we're talking thousandths of an inch lower. I have my sights completely out of my way. As you guys know, or maybe you don't know, I prefer my rear sight forward of the optic, but it doesn't break my heart if that's not the way, if that's the way the gun comes, or if it can't be set up that way. So if I'm milling a gun, that's the way I'm gonna get it done. If this is the only way to get it, I'm just gonna go ahead and accept that. Although I do prefer that iron sight to be completely out of my way, completely out of the lens, and it's only there if I need it, if I'm looking for it specifically to shoot with iron sights. But because these sights sit so low, it gave me that same feeling. Anytime I came out of the holster, I had a lot of window to use. And the only time I noticed them sights is when I was specifically trying to shoot with them. Talking specifically about the trigger, going to be doing 2,000 rounds with this thing, and I noticed as soon as I started zeroing it that they're not kidding about that trigger being around in the 2 pounds of single action only pull, which if you're familiar with single action triggers, especially 1911 style triggers, you know that straight back pull, if you're low in poundage, you have to be very specific with your finger placement. There is no prep on that trigger. You make contact the moment you're ready to shoot, and then you start your press, and then bang, the gun goes off. So there's not a lot of time in that press to change your mind, which is why proper practice and proper training, proper discipline of the finger is hugely important. None so more as with this gun. This gun potentially in the wrong hands could be an ND machine. So it's very important that if you're looking into an Atlas Athena, you recognize the fact that you are getting a trigger that if you touch it, you better mean it. But we'll talk more about that as we go through the review. Very first thing I did, get the gun zeroed, and then I spent 500 rounds just getting familiar with the way that the gun works. Getting used to the controls, getting used to the trigger. There's not a huge departure really at all from other guns in this style. The one thing I continually appreciated during that first 500 rounds is those grip panels. Being able to put that notch fillet, and that's what I'm gonna call it. I'm sure they have a different term for it that I didn't see in the little brochure package manual that I got. It's not something that I thought I needed, but I'm glad this gun has the option. Also putting the swell panels in there, or the weighted panels if you want to make let's be honest, a heavy gun even heavier. And one of the appeals of a gun like this is that weight, which helps with that recoil management, even on a gun that isn't, it's not a short gun, it's not a compact, but it's also not 5.5, 6 inches long. That added weight helps with that relationship of weight to barrel length. Already talked about the safety. Safety performed very well. The trigger is very clean. Being in the 2-pound range and a 1911 style trigger, one, it's aesthetically pleasing, which is important to some people. To me, it's more important of how consistent the pull is, how consistent the reset is, depending on which trigger technique I'm using to shoot the gun, be it more for 25-yard B8s versus 3-yard. Let's see how many shots I can get off for that second beep on the par time. My only concern with it is they do mention this gun being for competition or potentially duty carry. This is not a trigger I would use for duty carry, but in that first 500 rounds I did get an appreciation for why it is that light in relationship to the way that the gun performs. Light triggers, to me, have always worked better on heavier guns than they do on lighter guns, because I have that more stability, more control, and I'm able to get the gun back a little bit faster because of that added weight, which helps with that muzzle rise, as long as your technique's good. And this is something you could do also apply to a comped or a ported gun, but in relation to this, I do appreciate the trigger to weight relationship that exists with the gun. Magazine release, flared magwell, everything worked great. I didn't have any issues in that first 500 round, which brought me to the burn down. Now, if you're not familiar, the burn down is 500 rounds as quickly as possible to see if I can identify any problems in those 500 rounds that you wouldn't notice with the same round count over a much longer period of time. So 500 rounds, and usually takes me about 3 to 4 minutes versus 500 rounds over 3 to 4 days or weeks or months. So here is your burn down. First to last round, no problems at all, except occasionally it would not lock back on certain magazines. For the review process, I was using the Atlas Gunworks magazines, also a whole bunch of staccato mags that I have, and I think there might be an MBX magazine or two in there. It wasn't really picky on which mags, but occasionally it would fail to lock back, which is something that has plagued the 2011 design, and of course, if we're being honest, the 1911 design for, well, at this point, over a century, although 1911's been around a lot longer than 2011, but beside the point. So that was the only issue I potentially identified. It did happen a couple times where on the last round, I just wouldn't get a lock back. Not a huge deal. It's something I'm used to from these types of guns, and some people may stomp their feet and say, well, as much as money as I'm paying for this gun, it better lock back. Yeah, cool. You must be new here. After that, getting into the last 1,000 rounds, if you will, of the review process, just using the gun as I use it for whatever traditional or whatever practice I happen to be doing at the time, be it from duty carry, from concealment, just what I'm going to practice with, what I'm going to shoot with, specifically looking for the overall performance of the gun and how it works its way into, and would it be something that I could carry or potentially would carry. From concealment, it's got the weight of a 2011. You know, it's a heavy gun compared to a polymer frame gun or polymer gun that some people might be used to. So it's not something that everybody's going to be like, oh, I'll just throw that on, that's going to be my concealed carry gun. Especially these days when everybody seems to be leaning more towards, let's put as many rounds as possible in this gun the size of a box of matches, and that's going to be my carry gun. Which, you know, there's a market for everything, I guess. The gun is accurate. I think that's one of the, and you're going to see that when I show you the before and after, before we get to the drop test. It's accurate in a way that I notice it, and I've gone through a lot of handguns, and I've shot a lot of handguns, and I own quite a few. Some of them I get rid of because I'm like, well, this doesn't do anything better than this, so I don't need it, because there's money trapped in there and I want it. But it's a noticeable thing when I see a gun that has a really good amalgamation of performance, features, and accuracy that makes me say, whoa, okay, this is an accurate gun. Accuracy can be boring, and what I mean by that is that you get used to so many accurate guns. It's just like an accurate gun's an accurate gun, and in handguns it's more of a relation to, there's more of an attention to the shooter's performance as much as there is the gun, depending on which distance you're trying to shoot from. But running this thing standing from the holster on B8s versus running it from the holster trying to get those sub-second times at 3 yards, there's a consistency of performance there, and the accuracy is something I definitely appreciate going forward. So even though this gun isn't 100% hand fit in the cave on top of a hill by a guy who only builds 5 guns a year, it does give us a degree of performance above what you might expect or what you see from other guns in a similar category without having to wait, you know, 25 years to get the thing. Shooting it one-handed, using it for one-handed manipulations off of optics things, and one of the things I had to look at when reviewing this gun is the optic system, right? So I'm gonna have to do drop tests on it. I don't drop guns for the sake of dropping guns. So if I'm just reviewing like a rifle, I'm not gonna drop the rifle specifically for that purpose, other than doing, you know, maybe a drop safety test, which I usually don't film because those can be kind of boring. But with an optic system that's unique to a particular brand of gun, or it's new for that brand of gun, or it's an aftermarket plate for that brand of gun, I'm definitely gonna do those drop tests. So what I want to show you right now is a 5-round group I fired for zero confirmation at 25 yards, shooting 124 grain gold dot. And then throughout the review process, every 500 rounds, this thing got to drop on a hard surface, be it paving stone or concrete. So here are your drops. And I know it makes you cringe a little to see that. It made me cringe to do it, to drop a gun that costs this much, that many times on purpose. The whole purpose of the drop test isn't because I think people are going to drop their guns from a shoulder height, although that does happen. It's to deliver shock to either the optic or the mounting system in a not scientific, but consistent height within plus or minus a few inches, because I'm not a robot. I'm looking to see if the optic plate mounting system is going to be reliable for hard use, be it, you know, just taking a lot of shock energy. In this regard, I mounted a 508 on it because I knew the optic could handle the drops. So if there was going to be a zero issue, and I would have to confirm this if it did happen, it was probably going to be attributable to the plate versus the optic. But let's check it out. Here's a 5-round group I fired after the final drop test. 25 yards, 124 grain gold dot. I would call that zero maintained, and I'm glad, because if it hadn't been zeroed, I'd be like, okay, well now I got to take this optic off, I got to zero it, I got to do this, I got to do that to make sure it wasn't the optic and it is a plate, unless it was something perfectly obvious. So that brings us kind of like to my final impressions. After 2,000 rounds, how do I feel about the Atlas Athena? I think it's an amazing gun. I think it performs very, very well, and I think anybody who was willing to make the investment in this gun would not be disappointed with their purchase. And of course, there's probably already an argument in the comments section about how this gun is better than that gun, because no one is more passionate than people who who gravitate towards 1911, 2011, 2019 style guns. And I do appreciate and understand that. However, I bought this thing specifically to see if it was going to do anything remarkably, noticeably better than some of the other 2011, 2019, 1911 style guns I've either owned or done videos on. And I will say that there's an intangible quality to it, which is frustrating for some viewers, because you're like, well, what does that mean? Does that mean like I should buy it, or does that mean I shouldn't buy it, or does that mean it's remarkably better than these other guns? And the answer to that is, I kind of feel like that's up to the individual. I have no problem spending this kind of money on a gun that's going to perform as well as this one did. Now, the argument can be very easily made that, well, you could buy a gun that costs a quarter as much that's going to give you the same degree of performance, and that may be true for you, but it's not necessarily going to be true for some shooters. Some shooters are low function problem, some shooters are high function problem, and I do appreciate the small degree of additional performance that I'm getting out of this. If you want to use a car analogy, it's like taking a 10-second car and making a 9-second car. There's going to be some money involved. So, is it overpriced? One, I hate that term because it's usually said by people who can't actually quantify what they're talking about. Exceptions to the rule, of course, but a lot of people's like, oh, it's just overpriced. And I usually ask them, what's overpriced about it? And they don't have a factual answer for me. They just emotionally feel that's too expensive, or because they can't afford it, or because they wouldn't buy it anyway, or because they have a emotional biases connected to a slightly different brand, which is okay. It's okay to like other things. It's not a big deal. If you are curious and you feel like, hey, I'd be willing to spend that much money, is the gun worth it? I think it is. It's not something I would use for duty carry. I wish they didn't mention that. That trigger is very specific. This is not a gun I would put in any beginner's hands. Unless it was under close supervision and getting them used to different styles of triggers. But even then, there's other guns that do the same thing. So for me, and even though I have no problem whatsoever with aftermarket guns or aftermarket triggers and carry guns, I think that the whole thing that's going to get you in trouble court is a huge myth. Or lighter triggers. As long as the gun's safe and it can be court defensible. This is not something I would necessarily want in a duty gun or a carry gun. I feel like I would probably, if I was going to carry the gun for those purposes, I'd probably put a heavier trigger in it, because I want another pound and a half to change my mind. Don't get me wrong, a 2-pound trigger is super fast, but because I'm self-defense focused and a self-defense focused instructor, the guy I'm potentially shooting is not going to know the difference between a .19 and a .21 split. It's a great gun. Is it worth the price? I think that's ultimately going to be left up to you. I will tell you right now that I am not disappointed whatsoever in my purchase of this gun, and I have absolutely every intention of keeping it and continuing to use it. I'm Eric Count with Sage Dynamics. Train accordingly.